Good to see you all this afternoon. We're going to try to, we've got a good group up here, and we've decided that you all have gotten to hear a lot of the context, I think, and macro trends that have really defined education, not just over the last couple years, but frankly through that broad sweep of history. We have two founding mothers of the movement, we've decided as well, backstage. And so we want to get into some of this nuance over, the title of the 30-year overnight success is sure take a long time. But really a lot of the nuances of what choice has looked like in the K-12 landscape historically, but how the current moment is actually even questioning a lot of those assumptions that I think we've held, and dig into that a little bit more. And so I will be having my phone up here just to make sure I have questions, not to do the Michael Sorrell thing where I'm getting texts. But Michael already flew out, so he told me I could make that joke. But I want to start with you, Kim, because as I said, you've been at this work really at the forefront, the dawn of public school charters, choice and accountability, New Schools Venture Fund, incubating a lot of the, frankly, a lot of the innovations we take for granted right now in the education landscape. And I would just love to get your take on, giving us a sense of how the current moment of choice, education savings accounts, affordable private schools, charters, micro schools, tutoring options, all the things that are coming out. How does that compare to the charters, the movement of choice that we had before? And sort of give us a sense of the arc and the similarities and differences perhaps a little bit, just to start to set the stage.
Yeah. So I'm old, that's basically what you're saying, right?
Yeah. And I asked you beforehand if it was insulting.
That's fine. No, that's fine. I appreciate the 30-year time frame. It was 35 years ago we started TFA, 25 years ago I started New Schools. I was thinking about that with Carnegie Learning. We invested in 20 plus years ago. At the time, people thought it was crazy. Now it's mainstream. I think choice has moved along a similar continuum where originally charters were an opportunity to innovate, to give parents choice, and we thought to create aligned systems of management. So we created this construct of the charter management organization, so there were nonprofits and for-profits, hoping to reduce some of the political pushback. That wasn't super successful. I'd say what's different now is, as you guys have heard already today, the COVID disruption, AI, and the transition to Gen Z and Alpha Gen, which we didn't talk a lot about, but they function in very different ways. We've talked about them as different learners, but they are also not willing to enter the labor force and take old, rigid teaching jobs. So they're affecting us on both supply and demand side. It's a difficult conversation for me because as a parent, I made choices during COVID to put my own kids into a private option, which at the time was classified as homeschooling. And it, as a Democrat, stretches my political identity to realize I do care very much about the public part, the public purpose of public education. But mostly, with a few notable exceptions like Diane, we weren't able to implement the innovation part of that agenda. And that is, I think, a piece of why we're at a different inflection point now, where people still want that innovation, they want more of it. The populist data, I think, has been really instructive around mastery and life skills and something very different. And that is why we're seeing people move into the ESA world and other opportunities for innovation, affordable private schools, people who in the last iteration would not have thought of that at all. So I do think the moment is really different, and I think a lot about what that means about the future of charter schools and how we think about what does it mean to be a public school in that context.
Yeah, so that's where I want to go exactly to Diane, because, hi Diane, on our Class Disrupted podcast that we do together, you made this comment when we visited sort of 20 years of charters, and you're, as folks who may not know, you stepped down from leading Summit Public Schools for 20 years this past June. And you had said in essence, and I'm going to quote it, that charters hadn't been the change agent for improved pupil learning that you had perhaps hoped for when you first got into the movement. And that the innovations perhaps to the learning model that were needed, they hadn't contributed. And sort of, you left the comment of, did you think charters had a big role to play over the next 1, 2, 3 decades? Yes, but you were unconvinced that they would play that role. I'd love you to amplify on that, because that's a level of nuance in terms of the choice and frankly the learning outcomes we saw on the screen earlier that we should dig into.
Thanks, Michael. It's good.
No softballs.
No. Let me start by putting those comments in even a little bit more context in terms of, as you know, I do think charters made at least 2 very big contributions over the last couple, of decades, and that is one. I credit charters with proving that all children can be prepared for 4-year college admissions, full stop. And for those who think that others believed that 20 years ago, it's not true. And I do think charters did that. And so I think that was a massive contribution and really important. And quite frankly, for introducing competition into the system. And so I don't want to downplay those contributions, and certainly that was a big part of it. That said, in doing that, I mean, the first 20 years of charters, it's really about innovation and governance, and it's about innovation and efficiency and how we actually run schools better and more efficiently and, with different objectives and mindsets. It wasn't so much about how we actually changed what's happening in the classroom and the pedagogy and the innovation. And so that's the piece that I think that we have not yet sort of delivered on as a system of charter schools. As you know, I say, like, if not in charters, then where? And I don't know that charters are poised to make that contribution in the next couple of decades. And maybe it will depend on where we are in the country, but in a lot of places, charters are under greater attack than they've ever been under before. That's not true everywhere. And I don't know how to lead a system of schools that is innovating while you're literally fighting to stay alive. And all of the energy and all the resources just go to that, which actually inhibits and prohibits the type of innovation that needs to happen. And so at the system that I just left leading, I think is considered one of the most innovative and has made a lot of contributions on this front and is not poised to be able to do that going forward. It sits in 2 of the most hostile states in the nation, and they're just not set up for it. And so I'm not sure if we're going to be there going forward.
And for those that don't know, it's California and the state of Washington, speaking about political action earlier. So, Amar, I want to turn to you because maybe you are part of that engine of innovation of what that next rung of choice is. For those that don't know, you lead KaiPod Learning. You can tell us a little bit about this, but I'd love you just to reflect if you think the context into which micro schools are now entering is sufficiently different such that we might see that next wave of innovation that Diane is asking for.
Happy to. So KaiPod Learning operates a network of micro schools across the country. We're the largest owner and operator of micro schools, as well as helping other people start their own. In terms of the context, I think things are dramatically different than they've ever been. So if we look at demand for options, I think COVID took off the beer goggles that families had about their own child's school. They thought everything was great. And then when they saw it in their living room, they realized it wasn't. And so more than, I think it's 1 in 4 families this past spring were actively looking to change their child's school. 1 in 4, that number has never been that high. When it comes to supply of education options, it's never been easier to start an alternative than it is today. And the people who are starting them are teachers. 73% of teachers don't expect to be in that role in 5 years. And when we talk about a teacher crisis, it's a little bit of a red herring. Like, these humans didn't disappear. They just don't want the job anymore. They want to show up for kids in a different way. And a lot of them see themselves as entrepreneurs, and they want to start their own thing. And then one of the biggest things I think that's also changed is it's been really hard to innovate in education because you're always competing with free. You're always competing with a free public school. And before COVID, 2% of kids in the country had access to some form of a voucher or an education savings account. On October 26th, that number is 14%. In 2.5 years, that number will be 27%. That means 1 in 4 kids will have access to something that they can use to pay for a private option. That has never been that high. So now you take supply, you take demand, and you take the greasing of the wheels, And it's hard to see how this show stops.
So I'm going to come back to a few points on that, but I want to get Joe in the conversation, and then we're going to open it up a little bit more and less Michael asking and more just talking. But Joe, for those that don't know, obviously Odyssey facilitates these education savings accounts marketplaces in effect. You're making sure that the right providers that are approved are in the marketplace for a given state. You're helping to facilitate the dollars and payments from the families so that it doesn't get caught in bureaucracy and so forth. And I think a major question that people have around these dollars is the question of accountability. Like, what does it look like when we're taking public dollars? And you're facilitating, frankly, a marketplace that's not just funneling money to micro schools or charters maybe that open up to take education savings accounts dollars, but also tutoring, technology, your sports class, your music class, a field trip to Universal Studios, whatever it might be, right? We've seen all the headlines. So, you know, many folks, I think, are worried that we're seeing an explosion of choices, but it might not help people learn in the ways that society wants for those dollars. So I'm just curious to have you reflect and sort of start to launch us into what I hope will be the meat of the conversation.
So I think that ESAs are one of the ultimate accountability tools that we've ever actually had in education. I think it's a different way of looking at accountability, especially when you compare it to charter schools, kind of the last 20, 30 years. I think one of the things, and I come from the charter school world, is we got very comfortable in the education reform community of defining success with charters in a very specific way, which was primarily based on standardized test scores. There were other things as well. People focused on character, outcomes, things like that. But I think by and large, it primarily focused on test scores. And I think that was, in retrospect, to the detriment of the choice movement overall. The original promise of charters and vouchers and private school choice is the idea that parents, families are best equipped to make those decisions. And in our work, where we run 3 programs nationwide, together they facilitate programs for over 110,000 kids today, where they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars annually. What we see is that there is no one single component that all parents agree on is the most important. Usually what you see is that there are a mix of things. So some parents, when they're choosing schools through an ESA, they're very focused on picking a school that reflects kind of their culture or their values. Other parents want something that's safe. They want something that's local. Some want academics. Some are focused on extracurriculars. And so I think that one of the most important things that hopefully ESAs and the private school choice movement, which is kind of in ascendancy right now, can bring back into the conversation is, I think, kind of a more diverse view of exactly what it is that parents want. And that's what we see since we actually administer these ESA programs. We can actually see exactly where the dollars are going towards. And I think a great example that I like to give of this is, as someone from the Northeast, not from the Mountain West, one thing that's been very interesting is one of our biggest purchases in the state of Idaho, where we run the Empowering Parents program, has been something known as equine therapy. And I think you could put 100 policymakers in a room for 10 years and they would never come up with that as something that parents wanted. But it's actually a board certified licensing that allows people to interact with horses in a way that's actually kind of great for their mental health. And so I think those are the types of interesting, innovative, new ideas that hopefully are able to come from this new sector that's cropping up.
I'd love you all just to start jumping in and thinking about that accountability question. I mean, Joe's just put forward the idea that accountability is broader and can be parent-driven. I will say, we saw the Credo numbers of the improvement of the charter sector. Our friend Nina Reese recently stepped aside as leading the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. And she made the point it was not just choice, it was coupled with accountability in terms of the state authorizers that has made that rise possible. That's a somewhat different view from what you just put forward. So I'd love you all to reflect on this question. Kim, yeah.
Yeah, I want to just say one thing, which is what's on my mind is I feel like we are the technology industry at the moment when they made the decision on Section 230 that they could host all this stuff but have no responsibility for what happened with it. And there's consequences for individuals and for our democracy and so forth. So people can agree or disagree with Section 230, but the question is, how might we responsibly answer this question of accountability somewhere between let everybody do whatever they want, including go to universal theme parks, and where we've been, which we know we don't want to go back to, which is super rigid and very test-based. So like if that extreme doesn't work, and if that extreme only preferences what an individual family wants and doesn't have any piece around a collective good, a pluralistic democracy, being able to deal with people not like myself, like, are there a set of competencies we want to ask everyone to develop, and then you can choose the various ways you develop it. Could be one way to think about accountability. What might those competencies be that we can all agree on? And then there's a whole bunch of other ones you can pick that are because you particularly want them based on your values or your culture or whatever. Rather than distilling them down into a paper and pencil test, how might we proactively invest in the sort of experiences we need to figure out if people had reached those competencies, and then give that amount of freedom for how you figure out if equine therapy gets you there? Great, right?
I want to get in there. I'm very skeptical that we're going to all agree on a common set of competencies, and then we're going to figure out how we're going to measure them. I mean, yeah, we're just going to talk about that for the next 50 years. Fight about it. And I agree with you. I mean, I did this in my own system. We did this. It's totally doable. We decided on them. We built a whole assessment system, and no one cares, and no one wants to use that assessment system, even though it's valid and reliable. So the idea that the nation's going to do that is concerning to me. And so I'm sort of at a moment where I'm like, okay, for a little while, let's just let families figure out what matters for them. And most people in the country are angry right now. They don't think anyone cares about them or pays attention to them. So let them make some choices. And what I like about this is, for a long time, I felt like the school choice is too big of a grain size for families to have choice. So I think one of the problems is the friction of changing schools for a family is very intense. It's a big thing when you have to actually change a school. And where the choice should actually be is within the school. There's a whole bunch of things we can do within the school in the context of the school that are much more meaningful to a student and the family and don't require that friction of changing school. And so I'm interested in that, and I also become wary of that too, because as a working parent who had to plan summers for my child, and any of us who've ever had to do that, it's a nightmare. Summers were the worst ever because you're trying to cobble together all of these things. They're super expensive. Apparently, people in the summer only work from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. I don't know. I don't get it. And so that makes me fearful, but I wonder if we could think about how we could actually support people to have more choice within a place that, and we've talked about this a lot, Michael, and people hate this truth, but the reality is the public needs and wants the public education system to provide custodial care. Like, it is child care, and it's a thing we don't like to do as schools, but it's what the number one thing they actually want from us. That was a whole lot of...
No, I'm laughing. Amar, you're going to get in there, but I'm just going to call myself out because I was on a conference call, I think, 2 years ago with Deborah. It was actually just the two of us, and I was at the pool in the summer with my kids. Yes. And she's like, are you at a beach or a pool right now? Anyway, go ahead.
I wanted to pick up on something you said. The more time I spend thinking about this topic, the more libertarian I become. Because I do think that ESAs are not the end, but they're a means to the end of a pluralistic set of options, or a pluralistic system of education where people should have lots and lots and lots of choices to pick and choose, to unbundle if they're ready for that. Because you're right, the grain size is too big. And I lost my second train of thought. But I think like that model of let's just let go of the reins for a little bit is actually probably a good thing. We've tried 30 years of top-down, here's what we want you to do. Let's let it go for a little bit, and it should make us a little uncomfortable. But I think as we understand families choosing education options, maybe it's like entertainment where they pick like the worst diet, Or maybe it'll be like healthcare, where some payers emerge, where they use evidence to actually decide what they're willing to pay for, right? There's a lot of analogs we can learn from other industries, and it'll be a while before we know what will work, but we shouldn't prescribe it before we've actually tried it.
And I don't think you can discount how big of a sea change the ESA funding mechanism is for parents to think about. Florida, which has one of the oldest ESA programs in the country, is a good example of this. When they first rolled out the ESA, I think it was roughly 85% of parents used it solely just to pay private school tuition. Over 5 years, each year that declined, which indicates that there is a level of familiarity that parents need to get comfortable with in this new system where they are and have the ability to pick and choose. And so the indications, because they are new programs, are that over time, parents do get more comfortable with that idea of unbundling education, picking it is what they want. And I think the second point is, ESAs by themselves are not a silver bullet, right? I think they are one way in which you're able to take funding, put it in the hands of parents, and that you're able to allow lots of innovations to flourish, but it's not going to necessarily be, similar to charters, right? It's not going to solve every single problem that is out there. I do think that with ESAs, it's important to remember that they are regulated. So even in every market, no matter how libertarian the ethos of the people who pass them might be, there is still some usually accreditation body that has to provide, an okay for the schools to participate in things like that. So I think it's a new area, it's growing, and I think there's still a lot to learn.
Yeah, I've been thinking about your point, Diane, and I think we're not connecting two dots that we should. One is most of the states moving toward ESA are red states, and most of the states that are moving forward on solid portraits of a graduate that are informed by employment are also red states. So I don't know that we're as far away from some level of agreement on what the set of competencies are. Those conversations are happening in parallel. They're not connecting at all. And so I think that's one opportunity to connect up the competency portrait of graduates folks who think of their work as to fix public schools, and the ESA folks who do not connect back to that. So I don't think we're quite as far away as Diane thinks we are, though I, of course, respect your experience.
Well, so let me
say anything about the blue states, so I'm not sure.
That's why this conversation makes me so uncomfortable, because I have very little to say about the blue states on this front of innovation, because they're not generally doing things that are enabling us to really push forward on really dramatic innovation.
So let me ask the question this way then, which is, and I was going to say I was entering with Kim's view in mind, but maybe not, which is, a critical question for the charter school movement has been this over the last 20 years. Are they public charter schools, which me and others up here have argued passionately for, or are they, private operators that are privatizing education in some sense, right? And so I think the question I'm curious to hear you all reflect on, and I get it's an absolute that may not work in this context, these new options funded by education savings accounts, so public dollars, are they public? And does the answer matter? Because if we don't think about the negative scenarios where we could have some bad outcomes that get headlines and might shift the regulatory landscape within these ESAs, is that something we need, do we need safeguards so that we don't end up in an environment that the pendulum swings the other way? Or can we just wait and see? Any of you can jump in.
I mean, the one thing I want to say about that is I am weirdly kind of less worried about safety and basic quality. I feel like we're smart enough to do that. What I'm more worried about is continuing the progress toward total tribalism in this country. And that's the thing I'm trying to figure out. If we do it this way, what are we doing to put up any guardrails or anything to counteract that so that we encourage people to get together? So I don't think governance is the total answer to that, but it's a question we can't afford to ignore, I think.
I certainly don't want that, but I don't think our public education system is helping to bring people together. I mean, it might be a system, but there's Jesse made the point this morning, it's a totally segregated system.
Yeah.
And where it's not, we just have people yelling at each other at school board meetings. So it's not doing that right now, even though that's what it's intended to do. I don't know. I think about the parallels to health and medicine, and personally, I have come of the age where I am like dealing with a whole bunch of new health experiences, and what I have discovered, I'm not going to bring you all into a menopause conversation because that might make you uncomfortable, but we should be talking about it a lot more because it's super real, and no one talks about it, and no doctor cares as much about my health as I do, and I think what this comes down to is, like, at the end of the day, no one cares more about my life than me, and maybe my parent or caregiver, hopefully. And I do think we just have to, even though we said it was about choice, I still don't think we've yet trusted families. And I actually think that's the thing we have to come to grips with. Like, we fundamentally do not trust families to make good decisions. So we're sort of doing performative stuff until we actually decide we're going to trust them.
I think to your question of are these public schools, again, using an analogy, if a student uses a Pell Grant to pay for a private university, it doesn't make that university a public university. If a person uses a food stamp to shop at Kroger, it doesn't make that a public grocery store. So if someone uses an ESA to pay for KaiPod, it doesn't make me a public school. So I think for me, like, those analogs are helpful because they're not actually, you're not changing the nature of the public system. And I think you guys made this implicit assumption that the goal of the public system is to prevent tribalism and to do all these things. That's an incredible amount of scope creep. That's really hard for teachers and superintendents to do that. Like, maybe they should focus on the education part, and other forms of society, other legs of society should help us with those other things. John Oliver just did a segment on homeschooling, and among many things, he made the claim that schools are our prevention system against child abuse. And when you take a child out of the school and go to homeschooling, you lose that. And I'm like, when did schools become you have mandated reporters, I get that, but like, that's not the primary purpose of a school. There are social services, there are other reasons to do that. So we have to be careful that we don't impose this incredible scope creep on schools and make it even harder to run one of these systems.
I think with ESAs, one of the important things to remember, and honestly with a lot of school choice programs, is if you go to states that really have robust, diverse school choice programs, I think Arizona, Florida would definitely fit that bill. If you talk to the parents about the policy mechanism that is funding their school, whether that's a KIPP charter school, an ESA school in Tallahassee, they often might not know, they're agnostic about it, similar to the way that you could ask people about how does the medical billing system work. Are you PPO, HMO? People have an abstract idea of it. And I honestly think that sometimes gets lost in this debate where people get very kind of siloed and, well, we only support charters here. We don't touch private school choice, or, we believe in vouchers, but not ESAs. It's a bridge too far. And I think at the end of the day, it's a conversation that's really divorced from the consumer, the parent, the family, which wants to go to the best possible school for their kid, and they're willing to take whatever mechanism allows them to do that. And so, in Arizona, either that's charters, it's tax credits, it's ESAs, and I think in a lot of ways, all of that is really just different funding mechanisms, and it gets highly politicized because we care so much about education, which is understandable and good, but in some ways, I think moving to a system in which we don't necessarily care how it's funded, but we are holding a high bar for quality is one that would probably benefit more people, because oftentimes I think the debate gets focused primarily just on that funding mechanism and not necessarily on that quality.
I just want to push you a bit. What is quality? What is the high bar? Like, who gets to pick? And is my bar the same as your bar? And if so, whose wins?
Yeah. Well, I think we need to move away from the government being the only one who can define that. I mean, we often in education rely on healthcare, and I do think that there are good proxies there. The standard of care for any medical procedure isn't necessarily dictated by the government, right? There are nonprofits, there are boards, there are licensing agencies that handle that. There are also certain, practitioners and specialists that you can see. And so I think that if we're talking about in education who could do that, they're not maybe very popular, but like accreditation agencies are
Very
somewhat-
not popular.
Right, I know that they're not very popular, but my point being, right, it's a non-government entity. They're deciding what they view as quality.
Cartel.
Right, and they might be able to help with that.
No, but wait, what you have to appreciate about what Diane's doing, many things, but one is you have to address the entire ecosystem and not just the governance and funding mechanism, right? So people always ask this question about ESAs and vouchers as merely a funding and governance question. And I think what's becoming clear here is, like, if you're going to move that way, you have to address the whole ecosystem. And then if you want those other players, great, then we have to invest in them, whether they're nonprofits or whatever they need to be, right? So that's a piece that just doesn't get any attention. And so I appreciate you indirectly putting that on the table.
No, this is what I wanted. Okay, we have time for a question. So Marjorie over here.
Hi. So I'm on the board of a charter network in New York City. I totally believe in charters, but I'm sitting here listening to this, and I'm wondering, like, how much is this a conversation going on in America? This whole idea of you can get money, you can take, you can take it where you want, you can get equine therapy with public funds. And if it is an American conversation, what is it about the American psyche that is driving this idea that there should be choice, you should take your own money, and there's such a lack of faith in what might be your neighborhood school? So is this an American conversation?
Half of America's having this conversation.
Well,
Not in your state.
opposed to China or the UK or some other place. Is this going on anywhere else that people are?
Well, it's the public subsidy part that's not happening in those places. They have two totally different systems. They have public, which only the people most destitute go to, and private, which everybody else goes to. It's just not subsidized by the government. ESAs, vouchers are a government, subsidy or paying people back, depending on how you look at it, to use public monies for your own decision making. That, I think, probably is a US only conversation, right?
But I think that's the difference. It's not public money, it's taxpayer money. I already paid into that for the purposes of education. In India, where I grew up, my parents never paid into the government system for education. So when they decided to go to a low-cost private school for me, that was, they had to pay for it. And this is why in places like India in the 90s when I was growing up, the public system was just not being invested in because there was no tax revenues coming in for it. So teachers wouldn't show up, the buildings were falling apart. And so this entire entrepreneurial sector called low-cost private schools or affordable private schools came up. And so 70 to 80% of kids in these cities go to a private school. And let me be provocative, in 30 years, 70% of American kids could very much go to private schools.
Yeah.
70%. That will be the end of public education in America unless something changes, right? And so that maybe is the next panel, that maybe that's the next question, is what will it take to stop that trajectory, or are we okay with that trajectory?
It's a really interesting question, isn't it? I mean, and then this conversation, I will shut up in a second, but this conversation, who gets to decide what's quality, where does accountability sit? The fact that we have to debate that. I have grandchildren in public schools in the UK. I don't think they debate that much.
Yeah, this is why this is the conversation that we wanted to have up here, because I think the nuance of this is incredibly important. I will offer one other question as we wrap up here. And Deborah, you have a.
I'd like to say real quickly, one difference in like India, Bangladesh, is that the systems are very low cost.
Yes.
Right. So our Catholic system, which is the only
Analog.
was wiped out. Right. And I know there are lots of efforts to bring it back. I think that's the dynamic though, that would have to change to make the U.S. system private affordable. Have an
Affordable private
system.
So, 100% agree. Enter micro schools. You can run a micro school for 12 kids at about $7,000 a kid. That's cheaper than Catholic schools. And you as an educator can start your own micro school, charge $7,000 a kid, get 12 kids, pay yourself more than you were earning as a teacher, and be a lot happier as a result. And that is the low-cost private schooling of the United States.
Till the accreditors come along and then.
So there's like two.
I do just want to share some stats from one of our programs because I think it's helpful for this conversation, which is in Iowa, which recently passed an ESA that we help administer, each student gets $7,635. The average tuition in Iowa for private school is roughly $5,250, which leaves approximately $2,000 or so left over. So there are low-cost options in the US. Primarily, many of them are religious, as Deborah said. But I think that gives a good sense for what these programs can cover in some states.
I have so many questions that we could go on. I know we're also running out of time. I'm going to throw them out there a little bit, and if we want to do some hot takes. One of them interesting, you mentioned the red state dynamic, Kim, a couple times. It's interesting, though, if you look at the founders of a lot of these micro schools, they tend to be more progressive on average. So there's a dichotomy there, according to the National Microschooling Center. And second, the curriculum conversation we were having this morning, that Larry, Jesse, et cetera, we're all having up here, it seems like that could also be profoundly different in an ESA world as well, where families now are making that choice as opposed to state boards and things of that nature. Any quick hot takes as we wrap up here?
I would just say those two things aren't in conflict, red state, progressive, microschool, in that when you do talk to families across America, there's a lot of alignment. They want school to be engaging. They want it to be hands-on. They want to prepare kids for careers. They want them to follow their passions. Like, that's a progressive idea and methodology, and everyone in the red states wants the same thing. So, like, there is a ton of alignment on that.
And I would just say, for as much as the red-blue divide gets talked about, in terms of average voter, both Republicans, Democrats, and independents, when polled about private school choice options, do support them. That's true in California, true in Texas, true in Florida, true in New York.
Well, we have dove into the deep end, and we're still just scratching the surface, but this has been fun. If you could... Okay, Jeff, we have like 30 seconds, and I want to do one other thing before we wrap up, so go, quick.
I'll go quickly. I think it's important to point out that it is possible to support choice, to support charters, and to remember that I was born in 1970 in the colored wing of a public hospital in South Carolina, and I might be the very first person in my family ever to make a white friend at school. This atomization that Kim talked about is real, especially in this current environment. I don't want to go to the South Carolina football game between the black evangelicals and the white atheist. I don't want to do that. That is not healthy for our society. And I think we're heading in that direction, and that is something that those of us who do trust families have to think about as a part of this conversation.
It's a great point. Do you want to, anyone want to offer?
No, I just appreciate the complexity you're sharing with us that we all have to figure out how to navigate instead of just having a high-level conversation about governance. So thank you for that, Jeff.
I'm glad we're getting into the ethos of the room. Before you clap, there are two people up here whose birthday was yesterday, Amar's, and Diane's today. Can we just sing a little happy birthday to rally us as a group?
Yeah, great.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday to you.